Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip back in time, way back to the medieval world. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself, not in your comfy bed, but perhaps huddled by a flickering fire in a drafty stone hut. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Outside, there's no hum of traffic, just the rustle of leaves and maybe the distant howl of a wolf. Your world is small, superstitious, and utterly alien to the one you know. You're surrounded by people who believe in spirits, saints, and curses, where a cough could be a demon and a fever a test from God. Forget your modern meds and therapists. Here, your well-being, especially your mental well-being, is seen through a completely different lens. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in an era where the mind, that intricate, buzzing thing inside your skull, wasn't understood as a separate entity in the way we perceive it today. Instead, it was inextricably woven into the fabric of the soul, the body, and the divine. When someone acted erratically or was gripped by a deep, unshakable sadness, the first whispers often turned to external forces. Was it a sinner's punishment? Had they angered God? Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, invited the malevolent attention of a demon? This wasn't just folklore. It was a deeply ingrained worldview. The very air around you felt charged with invisible powers. A sudden illness, a crop failure, or a persistent melancholic state could all be attributed to the same unseen hands. Consider for a moment how terrifying that must have been. No MRI scans, no psychotherapy, just an overwhelming sense of helplessness against forces you couldn't comprehend, let alone fight. The mainstream historical fact here is that the predominant understanding of mental health in the Middle Ages was deeply spiritual and theological. The Church, being the central institution of life, held significant sway over explanations for all human conditions, including those we now categorize as mental illnesses. Deviation from what was considered normal behavior often led to interpretations through a religious lens. Was the person possessed? Were they being tested? Or perhaps, were they experiencing a moment of divine inspiration, a spiritual ecstasy that blurred the lines of conventional sanity? Now, for a quirkier tidbit, did you know that some medieval texts describe a condition called furor uterinae, or womb madness in women? It was believed that a wandering or suffocated uterus could cause extreme emotional and behavioral disturbances. Yes, you heard that right, a wandering uterus. Imagine trying to explain that to your GP today. It sounds utterly bizarre to our modern ears, but it highlights how the understanding of the body and its ailments was intertwined with deeply held, often incorrect, physiological theories. This particular idea, while humorous in its absurdity to us, showcases a patriarchal bias in diagnosis, where women's emotional states were often linked to their reproductive organs rather than more complex psychological factors. Historians still argue whether the medieval understanding of madness was primarily one of demon possession, or if there was a more nuanced recognition of internal imbalances. While the religious explanation was certainly dominant, there's evidence that some practitioners, often drawing on ancient Greek and Roman medical theories, did consider natural causes. But even then, those natural causes were often framed within a divine or spiritual context. You weren't simply sick. You were sick because of a cosmic imbalance, or perhaps a moral failing that manifested physically. It was a time when the boundaries between medicine, religion, and magic were incredibly fluid, almost indistinguishable to the common person trudging through their daily life. You carried your anxieties and your joys, your wisdom and your irrational fears, all within a framework that saw the soul as primary and the mind as its often troubled servant. As you continue your journey through the medieval mindset, you'll find that the line between what we call mental illness and what was considered a spiritual affliction was incredibly blurry, if it existed at all. Imagine living in a world where the unseen forces were as real, if not more real, than the visible ones. A sudden fit, a bout of inexplicable rage, or even a prolonged period of silence and withdrawal wasn't just a medical puzzle. It was a cosmic event. The predominant belief, woven into the very fabric of daily life, was that demons and divine were active, tangible forces directly influencing human lives, including their mental states. If you suddenly found yourself gripped by what we might diagnose as psychosis today, hearing voices, seeing visions, acting in ways that defied social norms, the most immediate and widely accepted explanation would be demonic possession. This wasn't some niche, fringe idea. It was a core tenet of the Christian worldview that dominated Europe. Exorcism, therefore, wasn't just a ritual for the truly exceptional cases. It was considered a legitimate, even necessary, form of intervention. Priests, often the only educated individuals in rural areas, became the frontline responders to these spiritual crises. They would engage in elaborate rituals, chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, and displaying relics, all aimed at expelling the malevolent entity believed to be tormenting the individual's soul and mind. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? But for them, it was grim reality. The belief wasn't always about outright possession, though. Sometimes, mental distress was seen as a divine test, a trial sent by God to strengthen one's faith or to atone for sins. Think of figures like Job from the Bible, whose suffering was a test of his piety. This perspective, while perhaps less terrifying than demonic influence, still placed the individual's suffering firmly in the realm of the spiritual. It implied that their affliction had a purpose, even if that purpose was beyond human comprehension. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive belief in supernatural causation for mental distress, shaped every aspect of how these conditions were perceived and responded to. There wasn't much room for a purely biological or psychological explanation when God and the devil were seen as constantly at work. Now, for a slightly quirky tidbit that demonstrates this dualistic thinking. Some medieval theologians and medical writers actually debated whether demons prefer to enter through certain orifices, like the mouth or ears, and whether they found particular sins, like gluttony or lust, more attractive in a host. It's a rather specific detail, isn't it? It highlights the blend of theological speculation with a rudimentary, almost comical, attempt to understand the mechanics of possession. It's like they were trying to write a user manual for demonic incursions, complete with preferred entry points. You'd probably laugh if you heard someone discussing that today, but back then, it was serious business, often tied to confessions and penitence. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on demonic possession inadvertently hindered the development of more secular or medical understandings of mental illness. While it offered an explanation and a prescribed course of action, exorcism, prayer, penance, it arguably overshadowed any budding empirical approaches. You see, if the problem was spiritual, the solution had to be spiritual too. This isn't to say there were no medical interventions, but they often existed on the periphery or were secondary to the spiritual battle. The very act of being mad could be seen as a sign of either extreme piety, in the case of mystics and visionaries, or extreme sinfulness, leaving little room for a neutral clinical diagnosis. So, as you drift further into this era, remember that the mental health you're exploring is less about brain chemistry and more about the ongoing cosmic drama between good and evil, played out within the very souls of individuals. It's enough to make you feel a little, possessed perhaps by the sheer weight of it all. You're still there, aren't you? Drifting through the dimly lit corridors of the medieval mind, where the whispers of demons mingle with the pronouncements of saints. But hold on, it wasn't all about celestial battles and infernal invasions. Even a world steeped in spiritual explanations, there was another, much older, medical theory that significantly shaped the understanding of the human body and mind: humoral theory. This wasn't some newfangled idea. It harked back to the ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and later Galen, and it persisted as the dominant medical paradigm throughout the Middle Ages. Imagine, if you will, that your entire being is composed of four essential fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, choler, and black bile, melancholy. Each humor was associated with specific organs, temperaments, seasons, and even elements. Your health, both physical and mental, was believed to be a direct reflection of the balance of these humors within your body. Too much of one, or too little of another, and poof, you're out of whack. This mainstream historical fact formed the bedrock of medieval medical practice. If you felt sluggish and weary, perhaps you had an excess of phlegm. If you were prone to fits of anger, a surplus of yellow bile might be the culprit. So, when someone experienced what we call a mental health crisis today, say, persistent sadness, irritability, or even hallucinations, a medieval physician, if you were lucky enough to consult one, and if they weren't just a barber surgeon who mostly did tooth extractions, would often attribute it to a humoral imbalance. For instance, an excess of black bile was thought to cause melancholy, a state akin to modern depression. An abundance of yellow bile could lead to choleric temperaments, characterized by anger and aggression. The remedies, therefore, were aimed at restoring this delicate balance. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that the season you were born in was sometimes believed to predispose you to certain humoral imbalances? Being born in winter, for example, might incline you towards a phlegmatic disposition, making you prone to lethargy and colds. It's like a medieval horoscope, but instead of predicting your love life, it predicted your likelihood of having a runny nose or a grumpy mood. This level of detail shows just how thoroughly the theory permeated their understanding of individual constitutions. You weren't just you. You were a unique blend of these four fluids, constantly fluctuating with diet, environment, and even the stars. Historians still argue whether the humoral theory, despite its scientific inaccuracies, offered a more humanistic approach to mental suffering than purely theological explanations. While it lacked our modern understanding of neuroscience, it did provide a framework for internal, physiological causes for mental states, rather than always blaming external demons or divine retribution. It suggested that remedies could be found in regulating the body through diet, lifestyle, and even bloodletting or purging practices that, while often harmful, were at least intended to restore physical equilibrium. You might be prescribed a special diet to reduce hot, humors, or given purgatives to expel cold ones. Imagine your doctor today telling you to eat more dry foods because your humors are too damp. It seems comical now, but back then, it was cutting-edge medicine. You were essentially a walking, talking, and occasionally unbalanced cocktail of medieval bodily fluids, trying your best to stay in equilibrium. As your journey through medieval perspectives on mental health continues, you might be wondering, what happened to those individuals whose humoral imbalances were too severe or whose demonic possessions too stubborn for the usual prayers and potions? Where do they go? The concept of a dedicated, purpose-built asylum, as we understand it today, a place solely for the long-term care of the mentally ill, was largely absent from the medieval landscape. Instead, you'd find a patchwork of responses, often driven by charity, necessity, or sometimes sheer desperation. This section explores the nascent forms of asylums before asylums, the places and conditions where individuals deemed mad might find themselves. Often, the first stop for someone experiencing severe mental distress was their own family and local community. In smaller, tightly knit villages, there was an expectation of communal responsibility. Neighbors might offer prayers, bring food, or simply keep a watchful eye. If the individual was not violent or too disruptive, they might simply be cared for at home, perhaps chained to a bed or kept in a secured room, for their own safety and that of others. This informal care was the most common form of treatment, reflecting a pragmatic, if sometimes harsh, reality. There was no social security net, no public health service. You relied on your kin. However, when family care wasn't possible, or when behavior became too dangerous or intractable, the church often stepped in. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Monasteries and convents frequently served as de facto places of refuge for the mentally distressed. They weren't specialized psychiatric hospitals, mind you. These were religious institutions, and the care provided was primarily spiritual: prayer, fasting, confession, and manual labor. Individuals might be admitted as permanent residents, sometimes for a fee paid by their families, or as temporary supplicants seeking divine intervention. Think of it as a spiritual retreat, but for people whose minds were truly troubled. The monks and nuns, driven by Christian charity, would offer basic sustenance in a structured environment, which for some might have provided a surprising degree of stability. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that some medieval cities had specific madhouses attached to general hospitals, though these were often more for containment than treatment? For example, St. Mary Bethlehem Hospital in London, famously known as Bedlam, began as a priory and then evolved into a general hospital before gradually specializing in the care of the mentally ill by the late medieval period. But even then, the conditions were rudimentary, and the primary goal was to keep the individuals from harming themselves or others. You wouldn't find therapeutic gardens or talking cures. You'd find cells, chains, and perhaps the occasional flogging for good measure. It's like the medieval version of out of sight, out of mind, with a bit of religious justification thrown in. Historians still argue whether the transition of places like Bedlam from general hospitals to specialized madhouses represented a step forward in recognizing mental illness as a distinct condition, or merely a more efficient way of socially isolating those who didn't fit in. While it created dedicated spaces, it often came with severe neglect and a lack of understanding. The idea of psychological treatment was centuries away. You were either a case for spiritual healing, a recipient of basic charity, or, in the worst cases, a spectacle for public curiosity, as some of these early institutions unfortunately became. So, as you picture these early asylums, remember they were born of necessity and charity, not a psychiatric science. You're walking past stone walls that echo not with the quiet hum of modern therapy, but with the clanking of chains and the murmured prayers of those desperately seeking solace. You're still with me, tracing the faint lines of medieval understanding, and by now, you've grasped that the spiritual realm loomed large over everything, especially when it came to a troubled mind. So it stands to reason that when all else failed, when the humors stubbornly refused to balance, or the demons clung too tightly, people would turn to the most powerful force they knew: divine intervention. This brings us to the profound role of pilgrimage and miraculous cures in the medieval approach to mental distress. Imagine yourself, or someone you love, gripped by an unrelenting melancholia, or perhaps experiencing disturbing visions. The local priest has offered prayers. The village healer has brewed concoctions, but nothing seems to break the spell. What then? You pack your meager belongings, perhaps with a few sympathetic family members, and embark on an arduous journey. Your destination? A holy site, often a shrine dedicated to a particular saint renowned for healing, or a place where a miracle was said to have occurred. This mainstream historical fact highlights the immense faith placed in the power of saints and sacred relics to intercede on behalf of the afflicted. These pilgrimages were not casual strolls. They were often grueling, dangerous journeys that could take weeks or even months. You might walk for hundreds of miles, sleeping rough, enduring hunger and exposure, all driven by the fervent hope that a saint's power could restore your mind. Think of places like the Shrine of St. Dymphna in Geel, Belgium, which became particularly famous for its association with the mentally ill. Pilgrims would travel great distances, praying, making offerings, and sometimes even staying for extended periods in the vicinity of a shrine, hoping for a divine touch. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that at some pilgrimage sites, specific rituals were developed for those with mental afflictions? At the Shrine of St. Dymphna, for instance, a practice known as the treatment of the 9 days involved the patient praying, fasting, and walking barefoot around the church for 9 consecutive days. It was believed this ritual, combined with the saint's intercession, would bring about a cure. It wasn't exactly therapy in our sense, but it provided a structured ritual, a community of fellow sufferers, and a powerful psychological expectation of healing. It's like a medieval self-help group, but with a lot more walking and a lot less talking about feelings. Historians still argue whether the perceived cures at these pilgrimage sites were due to genuine divine intervention, the power of suggestion and placebo effect, or simply the temporary relief offered by a change of environment and routine. You see, the very act of embarking on a pilgrimage, the physical exertion, the shift from a confined home environment to an open road, and the psychological uplift of fervent hope could certainly have had a calming effect on some individuals. It provided purpose, focus, and a sense of agency, even if that agency was directed solely towards spiritual supplication. You'd stand there, perhaps for hours, in front of a relic, feeling the weight of your affliction, but also the hope of release, surrounded by others who shared your desperate longing for a cure. The air would hum with whispered prayers and the low murmur of desperate pleas, creating an immersive experience designed to uplift and transform. As you navigate the medieval landscape, you've seen how spiritual beliefs and bodily humors dominated the understanding of the troubled mind. But what happens when someone's mental state leads them to actions that disrupt the social order or even threaten their community? This is where madness and the law intersect in the Middle Ages, offering a glimpse into how society attempted to control, protect, and sometimes punish those deemed incapable of rational thought. Unlike modern legal systems that might differentiate between mental illness and criminal intent, medieval law often operated on more pragmatic grounds. The primary concern was often the protection of property and the maintenance of public order. If someone was deemed mad, often referred to as idiota or lunaticus in legal texts, terms that carried less of a medical and more of a legal/social meaning than they do today. Their ability to manage their own affairs, particularly their land and possessions, came into question. This mainstream historical fact is crucial. The law's interest in the mentally afflicted was often centered on their capacity for legal responsibility and the disposition of their property. Imagine a lord whose heir suddenly begins to rave, or a peasant who starts giving away his meager chickens to imaginary friends. The family, or sometimes the community, would petition the local court or the king's representative to have the individual officially declared non-compos mentis, not of sound mind. If successful, a guardian would be appointed to manage their estate, ensuring it wasn't squandered and that the individual was cared for, or at least contained. This wasn't about therapy or rehabilitation. It was about ensuring societal stability and preventing financial ruin. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that in some medieval legal codes, particularly in England, there was a distinction drawn between idiots, those born with severe cognitive impairments, and lunatics, those who experienced periods of sanity and insanity, often linked to the phases of the moon, hence lunacy. This distinction was important because a lunatic might regain their faculties and thus their rights, whereas an idiot was considered permanently incapacitated. It's like a medieval legal gray area, trying to categorize the unpredictable nature of the human mind, but with the moon as its co-conspirator. You can almost picture lawyers arguing about lunar phases in a dusty courtroom. Historians still argue whether these legal distinctions, despite their rudimentary nature, offered a modicum of protection for the mentally ill by preventing exploitation, or if they primarily served to disempower individuals and consolidate control over their assets. While a guardian might indeed protect an estate, they also stripped the individual of their autonomy, often for life. There was little to no concept of recovering mental capacity through treatment. Once declared unsound, you were generally considered so. You might find yourself confined, not in a hospital, but in a secure room on your own estate, with your possessions now managed by someone else, your voice silenced by legal decree. The clanking of chains, if they were used, was as much a legal measure as a practical one, ensuring that the mad remained separated from the sane world of contracts and societal norms. As you continue your deep dive into the medieval mind, you'll notice that not all mental distress was perceived or treated equally. For women, in particular, the experience of a troubled mind was often filtered through a specific, often prejudiced lens. This brings us to a pervasive and deeply problematic concept of the era: women and hysteria. Imagine living in a society where your very physiology was believed to predispose you to emotional instability. This was often the case for medieval women. While men might be melancholic due to an excess of black bile or aggressive due to yellow bile, women's emotional and behavioral disturbances were frequently attributed to their reproductive organs, particularly the uterus. This mainstream historical fact is the concept of womb madness or furor uterinus, which we briefly touched on earlier, and its broader impact on how women's mental health was understood. It was believed that if the uterus wasn't occupied through marriage, childbirth, or sexual activity, it could wander through the body, causing all manner of physical and mental ailments, from anxiety and depression to fits and visions. The very word hysteria derives from the Greek word for womb, hystera, highlighting the ancient roots of this gender diagnosis. If a woman displayed unusual emotional outbursts, expressed desires deemed inappropriate, or suffered from inexplicable physical symptoms, like fainting or paralysis, it was often dismissed as a manifestation of her unruly womb. This provided a convenient, albeit entirely false, explanation for a wide range of female experiences, effectively medicalizing and pathologizing anything that deviated from societal expectations of female docility and piety. It was a way to explain away female agency or distress by attributing it to an uncontrollable biological force. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that one proposed cure for wandering uteri and hysteria involves strong-smelling substances? If the uterus was thought to be wandering upwards and causing suffocation or distress in the chest or head, foul odors might be placed near the woman's nose to drive the uterus back down. Conversely, pleasant smells might be applied near the lower body to entice it back into place. It's like a medieval game of hide and seek with an internal organ, using perfumes and pungent herbs as bait. You can almost smell the medieval physician holding a bunch of rotting onions under a woman's nose, convinced he was performing cutting-edge medicine. Historians still argue whether the concept of hysteria, despite its misogynistic underpinnings, allowed some women a form of socially sanctioned expression for their frustrations and anxieties in a highly restrictive patriarchal society. While it certainly led to misdiagnosis and often demeaning treatments, some scholars suggest that feigning or genuinely experiencing these symptoms might have been one of the few ways a woman could attract attention, avoid unwanted duties, or even gain temporary respite from societal pressures. You see, if your uterus was wandering, you might be excused from certain chores or granted a period of rest. It was a strange, paradoxical situation where a diagnosis rooted in prejudice could, on rare occasions, inadvertently offer a temporary, if humiliating, escape. You're left with the unsettling thought that for many women, the very fabric of their being was perceived as inherently unstable, a ticking biological time bomb ready to explode into irrationality at any moment. As you continue your exploration of medieval mental landscapes, you might assume all forms of sadness or emotional turmoil were viewed with suspicion or fear. But fascinatingly, there was one particular mental state that, under certain circumstances, wasn't just tolerated, but sometimes even romanticized: melancholy. This section delves into how sadness, particularly a deep, contemplative form of it, could be seen as a sign of intelligence or spiritual depth, rather than merely an affliction, especially among the elite. Recall our earlier discussion of the humoral theory, where an excess of black bile was linked to melancholy. While this generally implied an imbalance, there was a nuanced understanding, particularly in later medieval thought influenced by classical philosophers like Aristotle, that connected melancholy with genius. This mainstream historical fact is the emergence of the concept of the learned melancholic or the melancholic genius. If you were a scholar, an artist, or a deeply contemplative individual, a certain degree of sadness or pensiveness was almost expected. It was seen as a sign of deep thought, introspection, and a sensitivity to the world that lesser minds might not possess. Imagine a scholar hunched over ancient texts, lost in contemplation, perhaps with a furrowed brow and a perpetually serious expression. This wasn't necessarily a person to be pitied or cured. Rather, they might be admired for their profound intellect. This particular shade of melancholy was distinct from the incapacitating despair that led to social withdrawal or erratic behavior. It was a more refined, almost noble form of sadness, a sort of intellectual angst. You could almost hear a medieval intellectual sighing. Ah, yes, just a touch of black bile today. Good for the musings. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that certain astrological configurations were believed to predispose individuals to melancholy, particularly those born under the influence of Saturn? Saturn, the most distant and slow-moving of the classical planets, was associated with gravity, solitude, and deep thought, but also with coldness and sadness. So, if you were a melancholic, you might not just blame your humors. You could also point a finger at your birth chart. It's like a medieval excuse for being a bit mopey. It's not me, it's Saturn. You can picture someone blaming their astrological destiny for their perpetually grim demeanor, perhaps while wearing a subtly coordinated black robe. Historians still argue whether the elevation of the learned melancholic represented a genuine recognition of complex emotional states beyond simple physical ailments, or if it was simply a convenient way for the intellectual elite to rationalize their own introspective tendencies. While it certainly didn't pave the way for modern psychology, it did acknowledge that some forms of sadness could be productive, even insightful. It allowed for a different narrative around certain emotional experiences, one that wasn't purely about sin or disease. You might even see illustrations in medieval manuscripts depicting scholars with a thoughtful, almost mournful expression, surrounded by books and contemplation. This was a sophisticated sadness, not the kind that required an exorcism or a pilgrimage, but perhaps just a quiet corner and a good quill. It reminds you that even in an age of stark binaries, there were surprising pockets of nuance in how the human experience was understood. Still with me, tracing the subtle threads of medieval thought, we've peered into the grand explanations, the divine, the humoral, the legal, but what about the everyday reality for the vast majority of people? When a villager was overcome by a persistent sadness, or a child developed strange behaviors, who did they turn to before considering a distant monastery or a learned physician? This brings us to the crucial role of the village healer, often a woman, and the local, frequently folk-based, approaches to mental well-being. Forget white coats and sterile clinics. Your first point of contact in a medieval village would likely be someone deeply ingrained in the community, often referred to as a wise woman or cunning man. These were individuals who possessed a profound knowledge of local herbs, traditional remedies, and often a keen understanding of human nature and community dynamics. This mainstream historical fact is the reliance on folk medicine and local wisdom for everyday ailments, including those affecting the mind. Their practices were a blend of empirical observation, what herbs worked for what symptoms, superstition, and common sense. Imagine a neighbor who's been withdrawn and weeping for weeks. The village healer might first sit with them, listening intently, perhaps offering comfort and reassurance. They might then prescribe a herbal tea to aid sleep, or a poultice to calm agitated nerves. Their approach was holistic, considering the individual's diet, their relationships, and their spiritual state, all within the context of their daily life. It was a hands-on, community-driven form of care, far removed from the institutional settings we've discussed. You might find them advising a hot bath with certain herbs, or suggesting specific activities to restore balance, like spending time in nature or engaging in communal labor. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that some village healers employed what we might now call sympathetic magic alongside their herbal remedies? For example, to cure melancholy, they might bury something representing the sadness, like a knotted thread, in the ground, believing that as the object decayed, so too would the patient's sadness. Or they might recommend carrying specific talismans or amulets believed to ward off ill humors or negative spirits. It's like a medieval version of positive affirmations, but with more dirt and less self-talk. You can almost see them digging a small hole at dusk, whispering incantations over a buried charm, convinced they were literally burying the problem. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these folk remedies and practices was primarily due to placebo effect and the power of community support, or if there was genuine efficacy in some of the herbal treatments. While modern science can debunk the wandering uterus or sympathetic magic, many traditional herbs do have medicinal properties, and a simple act of being listened to, cared for, and having a ritual performed for your benefit can have profound psychological effects. The village healer offered familiarity, accessibility, and a sense of belonging in a world where formal medical care was a luxury. You were not just a collection of humors or a vessel for demons. You were a person known by your name, with a family and a place in the community, and the healer's efforts were deeply rooted in that personal connection. You're still immersing yourself in the tapestry of medieval life, and by now, you've gathered that the medieval understanding of the mind was a mosaic of spiritual, physiological, and communal perspectives. But how were these varied interpretations of sanity and madness reflected and reinforced in the broader culture? This brings us to a fascinating lens through which to view medieval mental health, art and literature's depiction. Through paintings, sculptures, illuminated manuscripts, and written tales, you can glimpse how people saw and interpreted troubled minds. Imagine opening a richly illuminated manuscript, its pages adorned with vibrant colors and intricate designs. Among the saints and chivalric knights, you might encounter figures depicting various forms of mental distress. This mainstream historical fact is the pervasive representation of fools, madmen, and melancholics in medieval art and literature. These weren't always sympathetic portraits. Often, they served as moral lessons, comedic relief, or visual warnings. The fool might be depicted with exaggerated features, wild eyes, or inappropriate clothing, serving as a symbol of irrationality or divine punishment. Consider the allegorical figures of folly or despair in morality plays or religious art. These weren't just abstract concepts. They embodied the tangible fears and anxieties of the time surrounding mental disarray. Sometimes, the depictions were quite literal, showing individuals in chains or confined, echoing the reality of early containment practices. Other times, they were more symbolic, like a figure weighed down by a dark cloud, representing profound melancholy. The goal wasn't psychological realism as we understand it, but often to convey a moral or spiritual message. You might see a saint casting out a demon from a distraught figure, visually reinforcing the belief in supernatural causation. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that certain artistic conventions emerged to signify madness? A common one was the depiction of individuals with unbound hair, wild gestures, or even clutching symbolic objects like a mirror, suggesting delusion, or a broken staff. Sometimes, they were shown naked or partially clothed, emphasizing a loss of social decorum and reason. It's like a medieval shorthand for "this person is not well," instantly recognizable to the contemporary viewer. You can almost hear a medieval art critic remarking, "Oh, look, another one with the unkempt hair. Clearly, they're suffering from an imbalance of the humors, or perhaps a minor demonic infestation." Historians still argue whether these artistic and literary representations were purely reflective of societal attitudes, or if they also helped to shape and solidify those attitudes over time. While they certainly didn't offer nuanced psychological insights, they did contribute to a shared cultural understanding of what madness looked like and what it meant. They provided visual and narrative templates for recognizing and interpreting behaviors that deviated from the norm. You're not just looking at a picture. You're looking at a cultural mirror, reflecting back the fears and beliefs of an age where the mind was a mysterious realm, always susceptible to unseen forces and internal imbalances. These depictions, whether intended to instruct, amuse, or warn, serve as powerful visual anchors for the medieval psyche. Still journeying through the often somber medieval world, you might find yourself wondering about moments of solace, instances where the rigid beliefs about demons and humors gave way to something more comforting. This brings us to a surprisingly potent, yet often overlooked, aspect of medieval life and its relationship to emotional well-being: the role of music and mental soothing. Imagine the pervasive quiet of the medieval world, broken only by the sounds of nature, human labor, or the occasional tolling of a bell. In this auditory landscape, music held a significant place, not just for entertainment or religious ceremony, but also as a perceived balm for the soul and, by extension, the mind. This mainstream historical fact is the belief in the therapeutic power of music, often linked to its ability to influence the humors or to evoke spiritual calm. It wasn't music therapy in a modern clinical sense, but rather an intuitive understanding that certain sounds and melodies could alleviate distress. Consider a person struggling with deep melancholy. A medieval physician, influenced by humoral theory, might suggest listening to specific types of music to restore balance. Fast, lively tunes were thought to stimulate sluggish humors, while slow, gentle melodies might calm an agitated spirit. Religious chants and hymns, of course, were always available, believed to soothe the soul and ward off negative influences. You might find yourself in a monastery, listening to the Gregorian chants fill the air, their rhythmic, repetitive nature offering a deep sense of peace and order to a troubled mind. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that in some medieval medical texts, specific musical modes or instruments were prescribed for different ailments? For instance, the lyre was sometimes associated with calming agitation, while the pipe might be recommended for stimulating a melancholic. It's like a medieval musical pharmacy, where each instrument had its own specific emotional prescription. You can almost picture a medieval doctor pulling out a lute and saying, "Write a little ditty in the Lydian mode should do wonders for that excess of black bile, my friend." Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of music were primarily due to its spiritual connotations and the power of belief, or if there was an innate psychological effect similar to what we understand about music and mood today. While they certainly didn't understand brainwaves or neurochemicals, they instinctively grasped that music could alter emotional states, provide distraction from suffering, and evoke feelings of comfort or transcendence. You're sitting in a world where a simple melody, sung by a wandering minstrel or chanted by a cloistered monk, could be seen as a potent form of healing, a direct channel to calm the storms brewing within the mind. It offered a gentle, non-invasive alternative to the harsher remedies of the day, a quiet hum in the background of an often noisy world, providing solace when logic and medicine failed. You're still drifting through the medieval tapestry, and by now, you've noticed that while grand theories and spiritual interventions dominated, people also looked closer to the ground, quite literally, for relief from their mental and physical woes. This brings us to the fascinating and often surprising world of herbal remedies and potions, and their role in addressing troubled minds in the Middle Ages. Imagine a medieval garden, not just a place for vegetables, but a living pharmacy. Every plant, every leaf, every root had a perceived purpose, a specific power to heal, soothe, or even bewitch. This mainstream historical fact is the pervasive use of herbs and natural compounds in medieval medicine to influence both bodily humors and mental states. People believed that certain plants possessed inherent properties that could calm nerves, induce sleep, alleviate pain, or even expel evil influences. Consider someone suffering from insomnia or chronic anxiety. A village healer, or perhaps a monastic infirmerer, would turn to the botanical world. They might brew a strong tea from valerian root, known for its sedative properties, to encourage sleep. For agitation, balm, lemon balm, might be used for its calming effect. Some plants, like hellebore, were even used as purges, believed to expel bad humors associated with madness, though these were often highly toxic and dangerous. It was a trial and error system, passed down through generations, often with a blend of practical knowledge and superstitious belief. You can almost smell the pungent aroma of drying herbs hanging in a rustic cottage, a testament to the ingenuity and desperation of the time. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that certain herbs were believed to have magical as well as medicinal properties, particularly when it came to mental afflictions? For example, St. John's wort, which modern science now recognizes for its antidepressant qualities, was sometimes called fuga demonum, flight of demons, in the Middle Ages. It was believed to literally drive away evil spirits and protect against witchcraft. So, you weren't just taking a natural antidepressant, you were wielding a botanical weapon against invisible forces. It's like a medieval pharmacopoeia that doubled as a spell book, where a plant could both calm your nerves and banish a troublesome imp. You might have been instructed to carry a sprig of it, not just ingest it for added protection. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these herbal remedies was primarily due to their pharmacological properties, some of which are scientifically validated today, or the potent placebo effect enhanced by ritual and belief. While many medieval herbal concoctions were likely ineffective or even harmful, others contained compounds that did indeed have a physiological impact on the nervous system. The very act of preparing and consuming a remedy, accompanied by prayers or incantations, would have instilled hope and a sense of agency, which are powerful psychological forces in themselves. You were placing your faith not just in the plant, but in the accumulated wisdom of generations and the benevolent hand of nature, hoping that a simple leaf or root could bring peace to your troubled mind. You're nearing the end of your medieval sojourn, and by now, the intricate web of belief surrounding mental health has become clearer. We've seen the spiritual and the practical, the learned and the folk, but one institution consistently held immense power and influence over every aspect of medieval life, including responses to mental distress: the Church. This section explores the Church's dual role, acting both as a source of comfort and care, and at times, as an instrument of condemnation and isolation. Imagine the pervasive presence of the Church in daily life. From the ringing of church bells marking the hours to the sacraments that punctuated existence from birth to death, its authority was unquestioned. This mainstream historical fact is the Church's foundational role as both a moral authority and a primary provider of charity and welfare in the Middle Ages. When it came to mental illness, this meant that the Church was often the first and sometimes only recourse for those afflicted and their families. On one hand, the Church offered immense comfort and a framework for understanding suffering. If your loved one was afflicted, the Church provided prayers, blessings, and the solace of confession. Monasteries and convents, as we've noted, often served as havens, offering basic sustenance and a structured, spiritual environment for those deemed mad. The monastic infirmaries, though not specialized in mental health, would nonetheless care for the sick, including those whose ailments manifested as mental distress. The core Christian virtue of charity compelled these institutions to provide refuge, albeit often rudimentary. You could find yourself in a quiet cloister, perhaps benefiting from the regular rhythms of monastic life, which for some provided a calming antidote to inner turmoil. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that the Church actively promoted certain saints as patrons against specific ailments, including mental afflictions? St. Dymphna, the patron saint of the mentally ill, is a prime example, as we discussed. But there were others, too, associated with epilepsy, anxiety, or despair. People would pray to these specific saints, light candles, and undertake pilgrimages, believing in their special intercessory power with God. It was like a medieval directory of divine specialists, each with their own area of expertise. You could almost hear someone saying, "My cousin is quite vexed. I think we need to petition St. Agnes." Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on spiritual causation and exorcism truly helped or harmed those with mental illnesses in the long run. While it offered a concrete explanation and a prescribed course of action, it often overshadowed any nascent attempts at a more medical understanding. The ritual of exorcism, while providing psychological drama and perhaps catharsis for some, could also be terrifying and traumatic for the afflicted, and certainly didn't address underlying biological or psychological factors. You see, the Church, with its immense power, had the capacity to provide profound solace and care, but also to label, ostracize, and subject individuals to often frightening spiritual interventions. It was a complex and often contradictory role, reflecting the age's deep entanglement of faith, fear, and rudimentary attempts at care. You're almost through your medieval journey, and as you reflect on the various ways mental distress was perceived and addressed, one stark reality becomes painfully clear: the pervasive impact of stigma and social isolation. Regardless of whether someone's affliction was attributed to demons, humors, or a wandering uterus, the societal consequences for the individual were often severe, leading to profound loneliness and marginalization. Imagine living in a small, tight-knit medieval community where conformity was key and differences were often viewed with suspicion. If you or a family member began to behave in ways deemed unnatural or mad, the ripple effects would be immediate and devastating. This mainstream historical fact is that social ostracization and fear were common responses to mental illness. People, often out of ignorance, fear, or belief in contagion, whether physical or spiritual, would often withdraw from or actively shun those exhibiting symptoms. You might find yourself whispered about, pointed at, or even actively avoided in the marketplace. Children might be warned to stay away, and invitations to communal gatherings might cease. This wasn't necessarily malicious intent, but rather a deeply ingrained fear of the unknown, and a belief that such afflictions could be contagious or a sign of divine disfavor. The very act of being different in a highly conformist society could be a terrifying sentence of isolation. Your former friends might cross the street to avoid you. Your family might keep you hidden away, not out of cruelty, but out of shame and a desperate attempt to protect their own standing. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that in some areas, individuals deemed mad were sometimes forced to wear distinctive clothing or symbols? This wasn't always a legal mandate, but a social custom to ensure easy identification. It might be a particular cap, a specific color, or even bells sewn onto their garments, so their approach could be heard. It was like a medieval, less-than-charming version of a warning label. You can almost hear the faint jingle of bells announcing the arrival of someone to be avoided, a mournful soundtrack to their enforced solitude. Imagine the weight of wearing such a visible mark of your difference, a constant reminder of your separation from the sane world. Historians still argue whether this social isolation was primarily a consequence of public fear and superstition, or a pragmatic measure for community safety in the absence of formal institutions. While the latter certainly played a role, a violent individual needed to be restrained, much of the ostracism stemmed from a profound lack of understanding and empathy. The mentally ill were often perceived as less than human, or as agents of malevolent forces, rather than individuals suffering from an illness. You were stripped of your dignity, your agency, and often your very humanity, reduced to a fearful other. The quiet hum of the community, once a source of comfort, would become a deafening silence around you, leaving you to contend with your inner turmoil in profound, often crushing solitude. You've journeyed through the core of medieval beliefs, seeing how everything from wandering wombs to divine wrath shaped the understanding of the mind. Now, as our exploration draws to a close, you sense a subtle shift on the horizon, a slow but inevitable transition to Renaissance ideas. The medieval period didn't end with a sudden snap. Rather, it faded into a new era, carrying some old ideas forward while gradually introducing radically new ones that would slowly begin to redefine the human mind and its afflictions. Imagine the dawn of a new intellectual curiosity, where scholars began to look beyond purely theological explanations and rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman texts with a fresh, more critical eye. This mainstream historical fact is the revival of classical learning and the burgeoning of humanism during the Renaissance. While the humoral theory would persist for centuries, there was a growing emphasis on human agency, individual experience, and a more empirical approach to the natural world. This slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to chip away at the monolithic spiritual explanations for mental distress. People began to see the human being as a complex entity, capable of both great reason and profound irrationality, but not always as a mere puppet of divine or demonic forces. Think of the early anatomists daring to dissect human bodies, pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge. While their discoveries didn't immediately lead to neuroscience, they laid the groundwork for a more biological understanding of the body, which would eventually extend to the brain. This slow shift meant that while you might still consult a priest for an exorcism, there was an increasing possibility that a physician might try to understand your symptoms through observation and a nascent form of clinical reasoning. For a quirky tidbit, did you know that Renaissance thinkers, while still largely believing in humors, started to explore more nuanced psychological concepts like passions of the soul? These passions were seen as internal forces or emotions that could influence behavior and mental state, suggesting a move towards recognizing the inner life as a source of both health and illness, distinct from external spiritual influence. It's like they were starting to draft the first rudimentary psychological profiles, even if they still thought emotions were stirred by bodily fluids. You can almost hear a Renaissance philosopher musing, "Ah, yes, a particularly strong passion of sorrow has overcome him, rather than just an imbalance of black bile." Historians still argue whether the Renaissance's focus on humanism and empirical observation led directly to a more compassionate or effective treatment of the mentally ill, or if it simply provided new justifications for existing practices of containment and control. While the intellectual framework shifted, the actual conditions in early institutions like Bedlam often remained deplorable for centuries. You see, ideas evolve slowly, and societal practices lag even further behind. The seeds of modern psychiatry were sown in this era, but they took a very long time to germinate. You are standing at the cusp of a new age, where the whispers of demons begin to fade, replaced by the murmurs of physiological inquiry and the nascent understanding of the human as a complex, individual entity, capable of both reason and profound inner turmoil. The transition was gradual, often contradictory, but it marked the slow turning of a tide that would eventually, centuries later, lead to our modern understanding of mental health. Now, as the echoes of the medieval world begin to fade, feel yourself gently pulling away from the dimly lit cottages and echoing monasteries. The air around you lightens. The sense of wood smoke and damp earth dissipate, replaced by the familiar softness of your own surroundings. You've walked through centuries of fear and faith, of crude cures and profound human suffering, glimpsing a time when the mind was a mystery, intertwined with spirits and humors. The weight of that distant past, with its struggles and its nascent understandings, now recedes, leaving only the quiet hum of your fan and the soft warmth of your bed. Let the images drift, softening at their edges, dissolving into the peaceful darkness. You are safe now, here in your present moment. Just breathe, letting the last remnants of medieval struggles drift away on your breath, and surrender to the deep, peaceful quiet that now envelopes you. Your mind is calm, your body is heavy, and sleep, sweet and profound, is calling you home.